Give it just a moment more. Our ring joins have been stable for the last several seconds, but we just crossed the top of the hour. Russ, do you want to run the first part?
Okay, so let's get started. Did Ben show up? Yes, Ben, thank you for volunteering to take notes. First, this is the note well. By this point in the week, you've probably seen it a bunch of times, but please take note of the note well. Next slide. So this is the agenda that was discussed on the list. I think we're going to add to it a possible charter update. And is there any other agenda bashing?
Yeah, so I mean, this is John, sorry. I'm not gonna do service provider OB this time just because there's like no material update to it. But you know, I can certainly say that then if you'd prefer. Like, but we might as well.
Okay, that's you can. So we'll drop that from the agenda. All right. Next slide. I think that's it, right, Robert?
The end of the administrative deck. If nobody else has any administrivia, I'll go ahead and load up the RCD slides.
Okay, Chris, you're up.
Hello, everyone. For this, the 11th update, I think we're getting pretty close. Next, you can go to the next slide.
Chris, someday I'd like to see more than just the lower right-hand corner of that picture.
It's a very nice scene. I know, it's becoming my famous background.
It is. Okay.
There's a lamp as well, but that's not in the picture at the moment. Thanks for that. Yeah, so so just to bring everybody back up to speed, I think last time we introduced in the 10 update, a major change to the integrity mechanism using JSON pointer. So we decided to give it a little more time to get feedback. Wasn't a lot of list discussion, but in other forums, IPNNI and private conversation, you know, I've gotten some good feedback about it. The other sort of minor-ish thing that we talked about last time was clarifying the ISS subject identification. This also, I think, was discussed in IPNNI as well, but this is the exact sentence I added to the document, just talking about how the mapping of subject name field is not something we want to be prescriptive about in IETF, although other specifications may be more prescriptive about how that works. Next slide. Yeah, so just generally, if folks paid attention to last week, there actually is a lot of industry discussion going on about RCD, which is great. People are implementing it, and so I think we've gotten good feedback, and we've incorporated a lot of that. So I think we're fairly confident that we're in a good state. I did not refresh the SIP core document yet, but I don't anticipate any other changes there, although I'll explicitly ask the question on the list after this, unless anybody has any comments today about that document as well. But other than that, I think I believe we're ready to go back into working group last call, if everybody agrees.
No,
So
that
does
certainly
anybody-
works for me.
Yeah, does anyone want to speak against working group last call? Okay, I'm not hearing
Since
anyone.
Yeah, since you brought up that there's quite a bit of implementation, I know 2 weeks ago and last week there were opportunities to discuss whether or not we were actually had critical mass to have an interop event. Are we there yet?
I would suspect so. I think there's a couple of folks that would be interested in that. So yeah, I think we should sort of get folks to explicitly commit to that.
Yeah, and if it's virtual and it's on the big wide open internet, not necessarily VPNing into a common network, do you think things will succeed? Anybody?
I think
So
generally,
I've been kicking over, and I'm thinking that while we might be able to provide some network that people could VPN into to have layer 2 visibility in the signaling that's going on for what we care about at STIR, it's not that big a deal. And
Right.
being able to only see your own traffic may not be a downside, and it would certainly be easier to set up to set up a virtual event if we didn't have the constraint of everybody having to be on the same layer 2 network.
Mhm.
So if people are ready to go, I think sending mail to the list expressing interest so that I can start putting together the preliminaries on getting a host in place and getting the event going. We can run with it. All right, sorry, thanks for that diversion.
No, thanks for bringing it up.
All right, so next in our agenda, I guess, then is
Does Ben have a comment?
Fine. Question, because it went by really fast. I think I heard Robert say, everyone who is interested in participating, please send mail to the STIR list. Did I hear that correctly?
yes, please. So I think based on John's bash to the agenda that this is what we're doing next. Everybody agree?
Sure. I think this would be a fine thing to do next. So I'm John. As you can see, I'm in the middle of moving. There's like moving boxes around me, and I'm sitting on the floor because the chair that was in this room is now gone. But happy to be here today to talk about STIR messaging draft, which is now a brand new fancy working group item. And of course, this is a draft we've discussed a couple times before that is talking about leveraging STIR for text and multimedia instant messaging services. Logical extension, really, of the notion that if we have certification authorities that are already giving service providers authority over telephone number ranges, number-based messaging seems like it might be able to benefit from that in some dimensions. And messaging is always, I've been working on messaging for 20 years in various capacities. Like I'm a veteran of the IM wars back in the day. Like messaging has always been very fragmented and a difficult thing to get your hands on around. But the combination of telephone numbers and messaging might be a little bit easier for us to get some leverage on. So next slide. And really, you know, what this draft outlines broadly is two paths. First are to work with messaging. The first really just uses SDP negotiation in precisely the same way that telephone calls do. And so, you know, anything that is RCS-like, which uses negotiated, you know, SDP basically to set up sessions, or RTT-like, is potentially in scope for the first path of this. And, you know, there's been a lot of work on that, a lot of implementation of that. So I think that if we can just say we get it basically for free, you just stick an identity header in the invite that's setting up the session, great, okay, you know, we can pretty much get that for free. And then the second path is the individual message path, as in using the message method or something comparable to it, and having a separate security mechanism for that. We've been talking about protecting those at the MIME layer in order to avoid worrying about all the variants of like SMPP or whatever out there, really keeping it focused on the SIP use case rather than the out-of-band use case that in the initial version of the draft, we were kind of asking, people thought that was cool. Right now, I've added a bit of text to this version that basically just says protect MIME in these messages. And, you know, right now, it's pretty underspecified, or I guess I should say it's, you know, taking a blanket approach. It's if there's a MIME multi-part body and one of those things is a message of some kind, don't just hit the message MIME body, hit the entire MIME multi-part, just do it dead simple as that. I would be curious if anybody has any feedback on that. Ben, you're up already. I hope it's okay, but I'd be interested if anybody thinks it's not okay. We need something more complicated. So Ben, please.
So in, shoot, what was that RFC? The thing that Russ and I did a couple of years ago, 8591. We've got a section that talks about the potential issues with messaging systems that are using CPIM envelopes for metadata purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those networks expect to be able to change that metadata in flight, which makes it difficult if they're part of the integrity. So I don't know what the right answer is around that, but I think it's something we need to think about. There is text, I think, in, again, what was that RFC? There's text in 8591, section 9.1 that talks about this. And I think we at least need to think about if that should apply here and how.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to just include a pointer to it and say that the same considerations will apply to this. I mean, just out of curiosity, I mean, are these CPIM-ish systems in path 2, not path 1? Because I'm aware there's a lot of like CPIM and like RCS, right? But like that's not.
Yeah, I think it may be more in the MSRP style messaging. You know, RCS uses both to some degree. I mean, both paths. And I don't know if CPIM is being used in just pure messages or not. But I do know CPIM is, the one place that might be being used is in disposition notices. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's a problem there because it's less likely to be things we change in flight. I guess it might be. I have to go back and look at that. It's been a long time since I've looked at that. And then otherwise, I know it's been used in multi-user chats, and that's probably more session-based.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about multi-user chat in a minute. Certainly, I keep hearing, or I guess I've heard in the last week or two, that that RCS is gathering momentum, and that people are much more hopeful about its prospects than they were the last time we all got together and discussed this. And so we do at some point like need to talk to the GSMA about this, right? And I don't know if that means a formal liaison. I mean, I work there in other groups, and so I mean, I think I know the right people to ask to get into that conversation if we feel like it. But yeah, definitely we need the understanding of the use cases that are relevant to this. I would probably be content, though, really just to reference the considerations in the existing draft that Ben, you, and Russ did, and say that the same considerations will apply to any CPIM-like usage in path 2. But anybody have any other heartburn about just saying, look, this is a digest error of the MIME body? I don't think there's a lot of like multi-partish things that actually involve messages being sent. that I could think of anyway. Anybody think differently? All right, we'll consider that one. So that's some good guidance. We'll get that in. Oh, Mr. Rosen.
We certainly send messages with other body parts in emergency calls, but I don't think that, I think it's going to work for you. Well, I mean, I'll have to look at the details, of course, but we include location as one body part and the message as another body part in multi-part mime. So that gets complicated because we want to eventually get coverage for the location part. And then, you know, but that's a different issue. That's not what you're talking about here. But there is a use case for multi-part, but messages are only one part of that multi-part.
Okay, so it's good to know. I mean, it wouldn't be a problem, I guess, if it turned out that Stir's signature encompassed the entirety of the mind body in that instance. Is that a feature and not a bug?
Yeah, I think it's a feature.
Okay.
I could be convinced it's a feature. Let's say that.
Okay. As long as people aren't like munging it or like changing the level of granularity of location information as the message is in flight or something, in which case it would be a problem.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, I'd be surprised. All right. So let's consider this one. At least we see. I think we're comfortable with the mime direction, and with just eating up the whole mind body. But we definitely have homework to do still to make sure that that's not going to break anything for anybody. Next slide. So what is new? I did add some text in RTT. We hadn't actually mentioned RTT before, but of course that's a potential use case for this. I also added some caveats on what end-to-end means. I mean, I think we mean the same thing by end-to-end security for messaging that SIP Randy does, which I forget the name of Mallory Nodal's draft this time, but like that, you know. Clearly, the definition of end-to-end is a contested thing in many cases, and we clearly, I would not hold out much hope that this is literally end-to-end, as in from UE to UE, simply because that's not where authentication services and verification services in these networks reside. There's no technical bar to it. Certainly, one could build a messaging app like on a phone that incorporated AS and DS features into it, but I'm not exactly holding my breath for that. So I think which is basically what SIP Randy says. So I'm just saying we're inheriting the constraints of SIP Randy. I also ruthlessly excised some TBDs and even wrote like a little bit of security considerations. So obviously we're going to need more of that. And I suspect we might even need some privacy considerations just given what it is that's in transit. And I don't think that there is some huge privacy risk that is added by merely having a digest, signed digest of the contents of the message. But I want to noodle that a bit, just in the sense of how passports might be archived versus how the messages themselves might be, and like, it's certainly, or if you're sending this off to like a signing oracle, right, to like sign the message for you, you got to show them the message then, right? Like there's probably some edges on that are at least worth some consideration. Next slide. Yeah, so I want to talk about conferencing a little bit. I'm going to talk about this both here and in my connected identity prezo in a minute, because I'm kind of wondering what we want to say about this. Like, I know that for path one, where we're using like a dialogue establishment to secure the messages, even two-party messaging will end up requiring connected identity. And like for multi-part messaging, it really is going to come down to precisely which conferencing strategy you're using. Like it's my understanding from what little I've read that RCS uses a centralized conferencing system. And I think for anything that we expect is going to use dialogue establishment, though, whatever the multi-part story is going to be is ultimately going to have to depend on connected identity, right? And so kind of my proposal is let's punt this for path 1 to the connected identity draft, and like just just become like a core dependency for messaging, which it probably needs to anyway because you need it for the dialogue streams to start with. And for path 2, I think things just work, like because for any system where you're just kind of multicasting your SIP message method out to a group chat list, every message gets signed as is appropriate. And so I don't think there's a lot that we need to mull about path 2, but this is another one I wanted to throw to the group. I mean, does anybody have any thoughts about this in terms of, the difference between the two approaches? Like, is there anything for path 2 that isn't true? That like there's some reason why group chat wouldn't function that way? I mean, I guess if there was like a centralized like exploder for messages that was managing your group chat list or something like that, basically doing it as a parallel forking implementation. In that case, unless that thing is behind your AS, then obviously you would be able to get the benefit. So I mean, there's maybe like a couple sentences like that worth saying, but I mean, basically, I think that works. Anybody see any potential problems here? Went.
Hey, John. It's Chris. We didn't talk about this, but in Passport, we do have multiple destination array capability. I don't know if that's something to mention here as well.
It's a good point.
But I do think this needs a little bit of thought for sure.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And for path 2, that might even get us around some of the difficulties here, because of course all the authentication service needs to see the dest list, right, and to be able to look at that array and sign for it, because the only thing it needs to have authority for is the identity of the sender of each individual thing. I think where it gets hairier is when again, there's some exploder, right, that is responsible for this, and like if depending on which administrative domains it lives in, like, does it have to be distributed across all the administrative domains just to be able to sign for the originating identity of the sender of a given message from someone in the group? Robert, sorry.
Really just tripped over the thing I was going to bring up in your last sentence, so thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are considerations for path 2, and we would need to record those. And I hope this is all being minuted so we can make sure what it is that we need to record. But like this question of who needs to do the signing, does that signing thing, well, basically whoever is exploding a group chat list that is not being held locally on the sending UE needs to be like, behind an AS that can sign for the sending UE. And for multi-part chats, that could get complicated. As long as...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go on, Chris.
I was going to mention before, it's really sort of, and I think your comment about connected identity maybe answers the assumption there, but are we assuming that the sender does explicitly know all the destinations of their messages, or is that in the conferencing part of it, or things like that? So we need to probably be very explicit about those things.
I mean, what this is leading me to is that for path 2, we also need to talk about centralized versus decentralized conferencing. So in a decentralized conferencing model, right, I mean, the UE or effectively something adjacent to it knows the group chat list itself. And for those kinds of cases, I think this should work fine. For any case where there is, though, some exploder, basically more centralization to it, that could get hairy. Just because guests will fail if the sender doesn't know them. Roman.
The other consideration is all the matching, because, for instance, if you, again, with Explorer, if you have a destination ID, which is some number, which is a group, and then it goes to a whole bunch of numbers, which are actual individual subscribers, the sender have no idea who the subscribers are, and but the subscriber actually might know that this is the destination number which it needs to accept and match. So that might be another big consideration.
Yeah, we could use div for that case, actually, right? Like you could actually attach a div passport at the exploder, and like that thing is just turning that group ID then into the that pseudo number into the actual numbers of each of the participants and the messages it sends out.
Maybe. Again, it's just a consideration because again, matching been a problem, and they're like with messaging, especially multi-party scenarios. The other consideration is there are a whole bunch of like messaging scenarios where identity is hidden, but still needs to be like it's a verified sending party, but the actual caller is somehow needs to be hidden in some source. And I don't know if we just assume that it's verified by because like with a lot of those scenarios, the messaging is end-to-end, unlike phone calls where it goes to a carrier, gets verified, and just passed with some sort of verified header. In a lot of like RCS, they're essentially direct. So we might be disclosing personal information when all we want to disclose is that it's verified.
Yeah, I mean, again, and a lot of that will come down to UE versus who does it, right? Like,
yes.
I mean, if it's UE, we can probably use traditional anonymization techniques to protect it. And there's plenty of stuff in 8224 about that, right? But like, if we're expecting some exploder to be the one that's concealing these identities, like then you are basically just in a centralized conference, right? And like, honestly, you should be using like SIP event packages, to communicate to the participants in the conference what's going on or something like that. That's a good point, though. That's a good point.
And the last consideration, again, is just, especially for the path 2, is like how much additional, like how much it increases the message size and the actual complexity of processing individual messages. Because again, for path 1, it's leveraged across like a large message or conversation. Here, it's actually per message can be significant, like additional load on the messaging system.
Yeah, and I mean, I think these are the questions I want, the Brian Rosens of the world to be looking at, right? Who are considering these use cases, like for emergency services, whatever. If that will give them heartburn in terms of message size.
Okay.
Paul?
I was just wondering, how is there really a difference between an exploder and just like in a normal call scenario with call forwarding?
Well, that's why I was talking about div, right? I mean, I think div may be the answer to at least some of the exploder things. I provided that the thing you're sending out to the exploder is basically a pseudo number, and I gather like RCS basically does this, right? Where there's like some group chat ID that you register or whatever, and then you send your messages to that, and it sends it to the appropriate message service, and the message service is responsible for exploding. Like for any case that looks like that, I think you can treat this like call forwarding. Yes, you could treat this like div. I don't think there's anything we talk about in div that would prohibit a strategy like this.
Okay.
I mean, it's, we see div in production now, by the way, which shocked me. Like since June 30th in US, I see US production traffic with divs in it, which like I was surprised to see. So, I mean, it may be that'll start getting some uptake at this point. There may also be some other ways to do that wouldn't require using div. Like I said, I mean, a lot of it really comes down to exactly how you implement this group chat feature and like where the ASs and VSs reside in relation to the message service. There could be ways to do that are not so hateful. I'm sorry, Brian, you're up? Or Roman, are you still in queue? Or are you trying to? Why don't you go, Brian, since I invoked you?
Well, I just remind you that although there certainly are carrier message exploder services, the vast majority of exploders are just customers of carriers. You send a message to a telephone number, you get a message from the telephone number, and that's all there is. So, 99.9% of the cases are going to be covered by this.
I think so. Yeah.
Yes, there might be some cases that aren't, but most are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware, you know, and part of this is just things like carriers want to be able to manage maximum group sizes and things like that. And like, you know, so this has to go through some kind of policy service for it to interoperate properly. And so I'm aware of what the use cases are that motivate there to be some kind of an exploder in this. But yeah, I definitely agree with you that this is these are corner cases. Any other thoughts on messaging paths 1 and 2 in conferencing? Okay, given that, let us move on. And so, yeah, we've got a couple open issues to resolve. We definitely need to say a bit more about conferencing, and we've had some review in this document. I think at this point, more is probably welcome. I don't think this needs to be a terribly complicated or elaborate document. So, I mean, I think given another rev or 2, we should be aiming for working group last call of this. I mean, I think fortunately, most of what we want to say about it is just going to work, you know, with basically what we already did for STIR, which is great. Anybody think we're on the wrong track entirely? Anybody out there want to say we shouldn't be doing this or that it's more complicated? Yeah. Ben, is that what you want to say?
I actually am referring back to something you said very quickly in passing earlier about how doing STIR for messaging to and from phone numbers would cover a lot of cases. I've been kind of thinking lately, if messaging is not the straw that breaks fire, we only do telephone numbers now. I'm sorry, I've got background. Leaf blower, sorry.
Happens to the best of us.
Okay. I'm wondering if messaging is not the application that finally pushes STIR to think about identities that don't look like phone numbers. And I'm thinking about that because there's a lot of messaging that comes from things that look like email addresses. This happens with iMessage. There's a lot of gateways, you know, where you get email to SMS gateways. And you've also got things like the short codes, at least in the US, where you get messages from some business that is coming from it's a number, but it's not a globally routable number. It's basically from a dialing plan.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we just have to go fix all this, but I'm wondering if it's time soon to have STIR start thinking about how you would assert origins and destinations that don't look like phone numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works for SIP-like identifiers. I mean, you know, obviously RC 4474 was not telephone number specific, and really 8224 isn't either. You know, I think the slippery slope that I fear in this is precisely what you mentioned there, like email gateways and things like that. And then we get into what's the interaction with like DKIM or whatever, right? And, you know, I know that there are a lot of people in the industry who worked on the precursors to DKIM. They're still kind of mad that STIR just didn't do that. Like, I mean, historically, however, I would say, like, really, STIR, like the authentication service concept in STIR predates, as far as I know, like most of that work. But that's neither here nor there. You know, I'm concerned about what the interplay is, especially because the properties of those email systems are not aimed to be end-to-end, right? And like they're very hop by hop and store and forwardy, and like, you know, they have a lot of properties I don't want to be kind of transitively imported into STIR. And so I kind of would rather they just do STIR for email. Like, but I'm sure if I put out a STIR for email draft, you know, I would be burned at the stake by a variety of people. So let's get some other people in that. Ben, you have any rebuttal to that?
No rebuttal at all. I'm just trying to take notes now.
You can strike the burn from the stake from the record.
I didn't actually get to that part. I'm trying to condense stuff, but I agree with you, and the collision between email mechanisms and stir mechanisms, I think, will be ugly. And I do agree. I like stir better, but that's why we're all in this room, not somewhere else. The other one I was thinking is interesting are things like the short codes, which are effectively a dialing plan, which makes me wonder if you need some way of specifying a context.
I'm not worried about those. I mean, honestly, short codes are managed. There's, national short code registries and everything. Like it's, I consider them to be TNs. And I mean, there are a special case of TNs like service codes are that have some unusual properties. But like, I personally wouldn't be that worried about like signing for a short code as an identity. I'd also remark that I think 10DLC is getting a lot more traction these days than it has in the past, especially for some of these enterprise messaging use cases. And so, I think this works great for 10DLC. It's probably fine for short codes. And email seems like a much different problem to me than dealing with short codes.
Okay.
If I can make a comment or two. I was just going to bring up, and I know this doesn't have to be a constraint, but obviously the shaken PKI that we're looking at, is only in the context of telephone numbers. So that might be one consideration. The other one is maybe related to a potential charter discussion that we have, whether or not we want to bring those things generally into scope of STIR or not. I'm not hard set against it, but I think we do want to make sure we're considering those things in terms of maybe broader industry progress. So just something to think about.
So a lot of what Shaken really accomplishes, right, is the GA, the PA, the system for figuring out who should be allocated credentials and why. And for email style identifiers, we know the answers to those questions already, right? And so, it's really a question of whether the endpoints that rely on Shaken would be willing to trust, a VeriSign cert, right, for apple.com or something. And I think, I could imagine that would be a complicated GA discussion, which obviously we're not going to speculate about here too much. But certainly I don't think what the outcome would be from an IETF perspective of that discussion is, oh, we need a whole new set of CAs that are going to give identifiers for email style, search for email style identifiers, because we already have those, right? And they're pretty widely used in the web and stuff.
Well, and there's the sort of regulated world versus non-regulated world thing as well. So that's, I think, the tension that maybe we might see.
Yeah, no, fair enough. All good considerations, and yeah, we'll talk a little bit when we talk about the charter in a minute about some of those issues of what the scope really should be. So next presentation. Okay, this is it's not actually formally a BIS, maybe it should be, but we're calling it the 4196 update at the moment, connected identity for STIR. So next slide. So this is really looking at the fact, just for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, that there was previously a specification that followed on RC 4474, written by John Elway, called 4916, that looked at the fact that identity headers can only sign requests, not responses. And there's a variety of deep technical reasons why we did it that way. But ultimately, there needed, if you want to be able to get an assurance of which party was reached, then you need to have some way that a request can be sent in the backwards direction that can actually have a passport in it. And there are a variety of attacks I'm aware of that especially exist in the mobile space, route hijacking, short stopping, attacks along those lines that require basically both parties to a communication, or the service providers and both parties to a communication, to be able to mutually share identities. So basically this is making something that would look like a mutual STIR. And this is significant because the original threat model of STIR was not about this. This is why we're gonna have a charter discussion at the end of this presentation, because the original threat model of STIR very much is about who's sending invites and whether or not you should pick up the phone. That's what the basic robocall case is. And taking this to connected identity it's different, right? And like we need to acknowledge that changes the scope of these things fundamentally. But nonetheless, the mechanisms required, the certs required, passports required are all the same. And like, there's really no reason to do this if we think it could close some fraud loopholes. I just want to make it so like buys that are sent to tear down calls, right? Like things like that, like can be signed and can be signed, especially in more complicated cases where like call forwarding has happened. Otherwise, it really is just it's just a pretty glaring security vulnerability in the system we've set up. So next slide. So what's new in this version? Honestly, not much. This has been kind of parked as we're trying to figure out if we want to adopt this and go forward with this as work in STIR. I did spend a little bit of time, I like split references and like tried to clean some of that kind of stuff up. But I did put a little more text in on this notion of pre-call connected identity. And this is motivated basically by fraud scenarios where like I get a text message that claims to be from Bank of America and there's a phone number in it. I click the link and then I get a pop-up box on my iPhone that says, do you really want to call this number? And we're not giving consumers a lot of reason to know whether that is in fact Bank of America or whether they should trust it, right? If we had the messaging thing solved, that would help, but let's assume we don't for the moment. So, I think it's an interesting potential use case to have pre-call usage of this that either go from address books or from web browsing or from you clicked inside a message where you already have the number kind of entered in and there's a decision point of whether you're going to call it, where you do a medialist dialogue, basically. And this is the part I fleshed out a bit. And the fundamental premise here is that you send an invite with no SDP that has an identity header, so it's asserting what your identity is, and then have like 100 rel and require. And we just kind of accept that the intended semantics of that is a request for pre-call connected identity to establish a medialist dialogue. You do the pracs and everything, you get the update in the backwards direction. And then you can elevate this to like a voice session if you have decided that the called party is legit. And I think, I certainly acknowledge, as the second last bullet says here, this is not a small lift in the sense of, this require a lot of changes to a lot of implementations. But then again, for a certain class of businesses and institutions in financial services and healthcare, certain government agencies, I think there is a demand for this, or at least there's demand to address this problem. And like I think we get some additional traction on it by making this mechanism available. And so, we'll see what the uptake of that is. But, I think this is a kind of cool feature to do that builds on the basic building blocks of connected identity we need to just get normal SIP to work around STIR. So, Robert, sorry.
Forgive me if I've built the wrong mental model here, but I think what you're describing is I get random number foo. I then establish a dialogue with random number foo to see if the thing on the other end comes back and hands me an identity that I'm willing to talk to. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that has a security consideration to document if it's not there already, and I apologize if it is. For just livelihood checks, right? I am not going to poke the bad guy, and there may be consequences of me poking the bad guy.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So I mean, if really what you want to do is just kind of harvest who these users are, right? I mean, you're going to be revealing some information by poking them, yes. So I agree with you. There is a privacy dimension to this that would need to be documented. Do you have any more on that, or if not, we'll move on to Roman.
One other consideration is for a lot of those calls, like from financial medical institutions, you actually have a requirement that you need to start talking to the person within some period of time after the call is placed. And having a dialogue in the opposite direction can actually run, like, what do you do if you didn't get the confirmation back?
Yeah, for emergency services, that wasn't one of the institutions, the government institutions I was thinking of. I'm thinking more of like the IRS, right? IRS scams are a very common variant of this, right? Where I want to be able, when I see a number, to get like a vetted IRS logo. Yes, this is the IRS. Like have something that'll give me confidence about it. Now, this, of course, assumes that like RCD actually is properly managed, and I guess I'm already past that in my head. I think it is possible to properly manage it. Maybe foolishly optimistically, but like, yeah, that's the basic idea, is just to be able to give, you know, for these non-emergency cases, this kind of pre-call thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking like things like HIPAA, etc., where a call is being placed from a medical office to the end user, that they can actually verify that they're talking to the right party before disclosing any information.
Yeah,
And that's like in those cases, when you place this call, you're actually supposed to start talking to the person at some period of time, and you need to have a time constraint within which this user is being validated.
I mean, the good news is like, you know, these medialess pre-call dialogues, I mean, they don't like alert the user, right? It's not like the phone rings. Like a medialess pre-call dialogue is just established passively between the UEs. And like then when the HIPAA side, the HIPAA caller says, okay, I know I'm going to connect to Brian Rosen, you know, then they press the call button, right? So unless they're literally like, they have to talk to Brian Rosen within the next 9 seconds, like it's not like there's some post-call.
Yeah, it's basically, yeah, you're correct. It's like they only need to start talking to them after the alert, after the alert the user and the user picks up the call. So yes. If it's verified pre-flight, then it should work.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a use case.
Yeah, we should document that as well. Brian?
So I think that we should just document the case of placing an anonymous call, getting the connected identity back, and then replacing that, you know, re-invite with the forward identity and the media. I mean, that for a lot of the cases you described, that would work perfectly well. The bank is perfectly willing to do an offerless exchange with identity for an anonymous caller. It may not accept a media call with an anonymous caller, but that's all fine. Mm-hmm. I think that many of the cases you're describing would work just fine if you started anonymously and then went to something real.
Interesting. Yeah, because of course in your update you can always like change session parameters, right? And so sure. Like yeah.
I mean, you'd need a new identity going forward, but so what?
Anything fix? I appreciate that. Let's make sure that that's minuted, so I don't forget. Robert?
So I think you're talking about offering a service that allows someone to say, hey, who's responsible for this number? And who's a legitimate user for this number? And you're trying to realize this service by trying to set up a dialogue so that all of the mechanics that we have already for setting up a dialogue can come to play, and the owner of that number has the opportunity to, at the time of the call, make a decision about whether or not they're going to fess up to being authoritative for that number. So an alternate solution would be some different mechanism that we provided that would allow people that were always willing to say we're responsible for that number to provide through this interface, yes, this number will land on us.
Yeah, so, and I kind of have in the back of my mind, to be honest, some sort of like a directory service that will let you know what the RCD is supposed to be for these authoritative entities, right? But I don't think we need to design that for this to work. But if it were there, if there were some, again, just like web directory, right? Or enum kind of thing you could look at. But you're right, the property I want is how will this be routed if this is actually thrown over the wall to the telephone network? And like, I want to make a decision based on what comes back from that. I could do that in consultation with some other service I consulted and corroborate from that, right? But like, I think we still need everything that's in the draft for this to work, and I think it works without that directory, but with that directory, it's better.
Okay, so the just having that directory, I think maybe highlighting even more strongly that the real-time nature of the, you know, what's the answer to this set of questions given the way the call would be routed right now is an important property.
It is, because it's route hijacking attacks are one of the things I'm concerned about, right? These attacks where like mobile networks, like somebody uses like a camel-based attack to, you know, make a, you know, to impersonate a number, right? And like, you know, yeah, I want you to have to provide a credential that is going to make it clear that like this is not the proper entity, you know, to be the recipient of this call. And you can only learn that from actually routing the call to the entity. So we need to do this anyway. I think, you know, belt and suspenders, redundantly having a directory that tells you what you should expect when you do that makes this like a million times better. But I think, you know, I guess I view that as kind of outside the scope of this draft is defining that directory or service. So yeah, I fleshed that out a bit. This discussion has helped me flesh it out a bit more, which is pretty cool. So thanks for that. Any other comments on this kind of pre-call connected identity concept? Yes, Norbert. We're not hearing you, Norbert, if you're speaking. At least I am not hearing you. Is anyone hearing Norbert?
We're not getting audio. Took
No
himself
audio
out
here.
of queue.
Yeah. Norbert, why don't you come back, see if you can fix that. Let me talk to Jonathan here for a minute. Jonathan, what's
I'll
up?
just briefly before my own comment, Norbert says in the chat, dead Mike, I'll shoot you an email. Norbert's mic is dead, according to him in the chat. Anyway, what I was going to say is that we had a brief discussion also in the chat that it sounds like, unless you're an institution or something like that, you probably want to say you should not send back rich call data for pre-call connected identity. Otherwise, somebody could essentially just send one of these calls to every number, just do a dictionary attack on every phone number and construct the phone directory of who every number in the world belongs to. So probably all you should return back is, yes, this is 5551212, not this is Jonathan Lennox. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean,
you're saying the yes is probably fine, but this is Jonathan Lennox, probably not what you want.
Yeah, so I think the RCD case, obviously, for the institutions that really want to be able to tell consumers this is Bank of America, right, is more applicable to that. But I think there's probably a mix of some of that discussion we had earlier about anonymity of replies being upgraded when you actually turn it into a media session. There are a bunch of things like that that I think are potentially useful. But yeah, I agree. You don't want people to be able to war dial this basically to build their own CNAM database. Okay, cool. So next slide. Go on. This is just a graphic. We've already talked about this enough. Conferencing, right? So I did have a little bit of text saying, should really think about conferencing, largely just based on the stuff that I was revising already for the messaging draft, and since I was already planning to like punt some of that basically to the connected identity draft, and basically my easy road proposal, my proposal that seems like the least work, maybe ill-advised work, but it's the least work I can think of we could do and get something out that might be useful. Is to declare centralized conferencing basically out of scope. In other words, the ways you learn about participants in a centralized conference are, are secured separately. That could be a SIP event package that's telling you. Really, all you need is the identity for each participant that's like calling in to the call. And it's in the dial-out case, you need connected identity for it to work, right? But like other than that, just declare centralized conferencing out of scope. Those are, for 99% of the cases, it's I'm dialing into a centralized MUX and I will send it my identity header when I do, and that centralized MUX will send notifies to all the conference participants or whatever, telling them this person got added, and I was able to guarantee with STIR, right, that they were okay. to do that first, and then claim that we get decentralized for free. Basically, each participant does connected identity with each other participant, and we don't need to do anything for that. So that's my modest proposal. Jonathan, I can see you're already in queue for this. What, tell me why my easy road is
No,
too
no,
easy.
I didn't. I think it's fine. I just wanted to also say I think there is benefit from getting the connected identity of, yes, you have reached the conference bridge, not something else. So
fair
identity that this is the conference bridge. This is WebEx or Jitsi or whoever, not some random person impersonating them is valuable, but that's just as easy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more concerned about if I'm doing connected identity, do I need to do it with all the people through the conference?
No, I don't think so.
Proxy
I think that's
that's when I was clutching my head and being like, no, I'm not going to do that.
But I think yes, you really have reached the conference bridge company you think you've reached is a useful thing. And
yeah, fair enough. Brian, did you have something there? I saw you flitting in and out.
I was just going to reinforce exactly that I would like to get the RCD from, pick a company, Cisco, that when I called Cisco, I was on a Cisco conference bridge, that I reached the Cisco conference bridge and nobody else, because if I'm having a a confidential discussion, I want to make sure that I'm who I say yes. And I think going anything beyond that, rosters and everything else is beyond what we're talking about. Not an issue. Don't talk about it. Disclaim any responsibility for it.
Yes.
The only thing you've got is the identity of the bridge. Stop.
Yeah. That's my plan. Disclaim responsibility.
Do that.
Okay. Anybody else on this? I think we can do this and basically get away with it. Okay. I'm gonna try to get away with it. I'm sure the security ADs will love it. Okay, next slide. Still to do, so 4917 had some beautiful examples that have been done of all this. I'll have some examples generated from our implementation when we think this is stable that we can put into it. I haven't gone through like a normative revision changelog because I'm not treating this as a BIS yet. I guess that's a question to people. Should I treat this as a BIS, or do we think this is different enough? In other words, 4916 was written for 4474, and is 8224 different enough from 4474 that we don't really want to treat this like a BIS, but as like just an update or a different, because it's not like we're clobbering some protocol field or something like that, right? We're not. I mean that there's a mechanism using 100 rel that's articulated in 4916 that we're borrowing, but so far I've been thinking this isn't actually a BIS, but we should still kind of explain that we don't have identity info headers anymore and things like that are different from what the text was in 4916. Yes, Robert.
It feels to me it's a different usage in that you're not actually trying to change what 4916 says, and you're not asking implementers of 4916 to go change your implementation unless they're trying to pick up a new application. So yeah, I don't even think cue the gen dispatch conversation. I don't think even an updates header here is going to be the right thing to do unless we need to go back and change something that 4916 required.
I don't think we do.
I don't think we're going to. So, it should just stand alone.
I'll stick with that.
Contrarian view. 8224 obsoleted 4474. Seems like we're doing exactly the same thing. There isn't any use case for the original 4916. If you consider 4474 to be obsoleted.
Yeah, I mean this is very the gen dispatch discussion. If some implementation of 4474 still existed, even though we've obsoleted it, you would still do 4916 with it instead of this new thing.
But in the same sense that if you obsoleted 4916 and you implemented 4474, you could implement 4916 with the same obsoleted header. So what? The RFCs don't go away ever. That's fine.
Yeah. Well, what do you think, Robert?
It's I think it's deck chairs at this point. So I don't really care that much. If you think, yeah, somebody
Murray?
probably should go ahead and obsolete 4916, whether you do it with this document then or not. But
Yeah, I mean, I
path of
wouldn't
least
mind
resistance is my
obsoleting.
recommendation.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind obsoleting 4916. I believe it is obsolete. And so, I mean, that could just be done in general principle as a side effect of what we're doing here. We could just put in, oh, by the way, 4916 is obsolete, right? Like, without necessarily presuming that we're, that this is intended to be a direct successor mechanism. Yeah. I'll leave that to the Murrays of the world to figure out. Murray, what do you think?
I heard my name there, and I don't think I have a preference. I guess the only question I might ask is, does it matter if this becomes obsoleted without something to replace it? Or can that be done, there's no need to tie those things together? Up to you guys.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing is that this is a kind of feature that's nice to have, but it wasn't core to what we originally planned for STIR. And so, like, yeah, I don't know. Well, let's kick the can on that one. This isn't even a working group item yet. Let's kick the can on that one. And based on the discussion here today, I will flesh out a bit more of the pre-call connected identity approach and the conferencing stuff from this. So that's still on the to-do. But next slide. Yeah, I think we need this. I think we should adopt it, but I think we should recharter before we adopt it. And so I have some new draft charter text that the chairs have seen. The salient part of it, I believe, is on the next slide. I kind of went back through the original charter and removed some of the things that were aspirational that we have now done, that were just part of the descriptive text of the charter to make it clear that the core focus of the group is the development and the maintenance of basically 8224 to 26. And but I said that we're also going to do some other stuff, that we will consider extensions that leverage STIR to solve related identity problems around telephone calls and other telephone number-based communication. Yes, to your earlier point, Ben, the charter is full of things that say that, right? That this is about telephone number-based communication. If we want to ditch that, that's something that we should discuss here now and kind of hack a bit. But then I just kind of included a laundry list of the things that we're already doing, basically, call diversion, forwarding, rich call data, messaging, connected identity, and similar use cases related to fraud and security. And I don't think that we need to put everything that we might conceivably do on this list, but the core things I wanted to get across from the revision were that we're in the maintenance business as well as the development business. When I look at things like Russ's must exclude draft or Chris's error handling draft, which is up next, like, these are good examples of what maintenance looks like for this, where we're going to encounter bugs, we're going to need to have specs that address them, or new features that are just directly adjacent to the feature sets of 8224 to 8226. So we're doing that, so that maintenance stuff. But I also want to signal that we're open to things like connected identity, which were not in the original 7375 kind of problem statement scope of STIR. And I don't know,
I apologize. I've let us run over. So I think that to be fair to people, we should have folks look at this. If anybody's got really nasty heartburn with a recharter that goes in this direction, go ahead and come to the mic now, just so that we know it exists, with just a quick, I don't think this is a good idea comment. Otherwise, we'll work with Murray to go down this path, and we'll run stuff past the list first. And we just really have to apologize to Chris for running over
We only
time.
an hour? I thought this was a 2-hour session at the first session every day.
I somehow managed to get that into my head as well, which is wrong.
It has been every other day.
It's all right. Nobody
But
has
on
any.
Thursday, it's a 1 hour.
I was going to say it's
There's
all
4
right.
sessions.
Nobody has any identity header errors anyway, so it's
So we'll
I
put
think
together.
we're already
items
5 minutes
to
over, so we
push
we
that
probably
one
do-
forward.
Okay, sorry about that. I would have been less chatty. Yes, let's do that. We'll send the charter text out. The chairs will, I presume, to the group, and yeah, we'll meet again next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben, for taking notes.
Thank you. Goodbye.